Halo Effect by Alex51324. Chapter 6. All right, Thomas said, releasing Peter from his embrace but keeping one hand on his arm. I'd really better go in now. You'd better, Peter agreed. We're both going to be dead on our feet tomorrow. It's been worth it. All right. He forced himself to let go of Peter's arm. Good night. Good night. He went inside, closing the door behind him, latching it, and leaning against it for a moment. Right. Back to reality. Now he'd have to face William, and he'd better apologize for being out so late, and absolutely not say the words dead on our feet. But when he went to the servants' hall, it was Bates sitting there. Oh, he said. Bates looked up from a magazine he was reading. I sent William up to bed, he said. Oh, Thomas repeated. Good. I lost track of time a little bit. I trust you had a pleasant evening. I did. Very pleasant. For an instant, Thomas was seized by a mad impulse to tell him that he, Thomas, now basically more or less had a sweetheart. Or something like that. He managed to quash it and just said, Well, I'm for bed. Good night, Thomas, said Bates. Up in their tiny attic room, Thomas was not particularly surprised to find William not asleep, or even in bed, but saying his prayers beside it, his hands folded like a child. At Thomas's entrance, he got up guiltily, as if he'd been caught out at something. Don't mind me, Thomas said, and set about changing into his pajamas and brushing his teeth, while William sat on the edge of his bed, staring dully at his hands. Peter, Thomas thought, would do something kind. Rinsing his toothbrush, he said tentatively, Do you want to talk about her? What? Your mum? Thomas elaborated. To William's credit, he did not actually say, not with you, but it was written pretty clearly on his face. No, thank you. So much for what Peter would do. Thomas took his valise down from on top of the cupboard and took out the flask half full of very cheap whiskey that he kept in an inconspicuous side pocket. What's a nip of this? What is it? Either whiskey or paint stripper. It's a little hard to tell. Might settle your nerves a bit. William stared at him for a moment, then hesitantly took the flask, mumbling, Mum doesn't like me drinking. Well, suit yourself. William unscrewed the cap and took a healthy swallow, nearly choking on it. Good blimey, that's foul! His eyes watering, he shoved the flask vaguely in Thomas's direction. Yeah, medicinal purposes only, that stuff, Thomas agreed, hiding it away again. That was why he still had it. It was too terrible to drink for pleasure, but he figured if he threw it away, there would come a time he wished he had it. Better lay down. You've got to give it half a chance to take effect. It wasn't likely that a single swig of whiskey would be enough to knock William out, but Thomas hoped that the power of suggestion might help. It did get him to lie quietly for a bit, long enough for Thomas to almost, but not quite, fall asleep himself. But then he was up again. He slipped out of the room with that excessive care that was more irritating than just going quickly would be, and then when Thomas was starting to drop off again, came back in. And so it went for what little remained of the night. It was almost a relief when the sky outside their tiny window started to lighten, and they could give up on the whole business. They were the first ones down, apart from the kitchen staff and the hall boys, and Miss Trout came out of the kitchen to fuss over William, bringing him a boiled egg and telling him how he had to keep his strength up. I'll have a bucket of sandwiches for you to take on the train, so mind you stop at the kitchen for them before you leave. Thank you, Miss Trout, William said dully. Is there any tea? William asked as Miss Trout turned to go. He was going to need a lot of it to get through the day on no sleep. Independent, she told him scoldingly, as if I don't have enough to do. Thomas shook his head at her departing back. Are they sending the car to take you to the station? He asked suddenly. William looked over at him, his expression gormless. I don't think so. Why would they? If you've got to take the tube, I'll go with you if you like. The last thing they needed was William turning up an hour after he'd gone, having gotten lost and missed his train. I'm sure I can manage. It can be a bit tricky, Zol, if you aren't used to it. Miss O'Brien appeared in a rustle of black bombazine. That's a bit tricky. Her tone was insinuating, as though Thomas might be trying to explain the finer points of buggery at the breakfast table.
Thomas doesn't think I can make it to the station on my own,
William reported.
I didn't say that, Thomas protested. No, but you meant it,
William said. Thomas tried to defend himself.
I only meant you haven't been to London before. That doesn't mean I'm stupid.
What are we arguing about? Asked Anna from the doorway.
Apparently, Thomas said, I've impugned William's honour by suggesting he might like a bit of help getting the tube to the station.
Honestly, if this is what he got for trying to help, no wonder he didn't usually bother.
Oh! Anna slipped into her seat. Well, I think that's very nice of you to offer, Thomas.
Finally, someone saw it!
To William, she continued, I'm sure you could manage it if you had to, but you do have a lot on your mind, and the way they announce the stops, you can barely understand them at the best of times.
Exactly, Thomas said. That's what I meant.
More or less.
Well, then why didn't you say?
William sighed, seeming to deflate as he did so.
Sorry, like Anna said, I've got a lot on my mind. I took it the wrong way.
Griff can make anyone irritable, said Miss Trout, bustling in with a pot of tea. She set it in front of Thomas, saying, There you are, your highness.
Thank you.
Mid-morning, Anna and Mr. Bates found themselves with the servants' hall to themselves. The housemaids and hall boys were turning out the drawing room, and Miss O'Brien had gone with her ladyship and the girls to her London modiste. Anna wasn't sure if he was sorry not to have accompanied them as the girls' lady's maid, but since it would have meant putting up with Miss O'Brien, she supposed it was just as well. It was luxury enough not to be part of the cleaning party upstairs. She did have a basket of mending to do, but at least that was sitting down work. And she could have a bit of a chat with Mr. Bates while she did it, which they could do as friends, whether he was married or not. After they'd talked a bit about William's mum, and then a bit more about Kew Gardens, she asked what he planned to do with his half-day in London.
Nothing too exciting, I'm afraid, he said. Go and see my mother. She lives here.
He was mending a seam in one of his lordship's coats and turned it right way out to inspect his work.
That's if I get a day off. I imagine Thomas will think he's too busy to dress him with William gone.
He'll moan about it, but pay him no mind, Anna advised. Or agree with him that he's the most put-upon person on the face of the earth, but he's got to do it anyway. That seems to be what his friends do.
Do you suppose Thomas really cares for him? The chap from yesterday?
I think so, yes.
Not that he'd said so.
They've known each other a long time. It's kind of a sad story, really.
Oh, so?
Thomas would not, Anna realized, want Mr. Bates knowing that he had been led astray, possibly even ruined, if that concept could apply to a man, by a series of upper-class men who were not gentlemen, never mind how touching it was that his childhood sweetheart had pined for him while it was happening.
Just that they can't really be together.
Oh.
Mr. Bates began testing the cuff buttons on the coat.
That is difficult, when there's someone you care for deeply, but you've nothing decent to offer them.
His words were heavy with meaning, and Anna concentrated much harder than she would have needed to on folding Lady Edith's knickers and stowing them back in the mending basket.
It is.
She thought carefully about what she was going to say next.
I gather,
she said slowly,
that Thomas has done some things in the past that some people might look down on him for, but Mr. Fitzroy knows the whole story and understands why he did what he did, and loves him all the more for it.
There! If Mr. Bates wanted to explain himself, she couldn't put it any clearer than that.
That's a good thing to have,
Mr. Bates said.
You should cherish that.
He put down the coat and said abruptly,
She won't give me a divorce.
There was no need to ask who she was. His wife.
I went right after we got down here and asked her. Told her that I'd pay her, I'd take the blame whatever she wanted, if she would only set me free. She refused.
He shook his head.
At least Thomas's situation isn't his own fault.
Why didn't you marry her in the first place?
Anna wondered. Mr. Bates sighed.
She said she was expecting. And then as soon as it was done, she said she'd lost it. I've come to think she was lying all along, but she'd not have been able to trick me that way if I hadn't done what I shouldn't.
He shook his head.
She had a hard life and she wanted someone to take care of her. I can't blame her for that.
Plenty of people had hard lives and didn't go tricking honest men into marriage. Daisy, for instance, whose childhood had been like something out of Dickens.
You can blame her for what came after.
But Mr. Bates shook his head again.
I did my best. I tried to be good to her, to make her happy, but it was so hard, and after I got back from the war, I just didn't have the patience for it any longer.
That letter from Thomas's regimental friend had said that his trouble started after he came back from the war, hadn't it?
What did you do?
I never hit her,
Mr. Bates said immediately.
That's not saying much, but that's a line I managed not to cross. I spoke harshly to her. I stormed out of the house and stayed away for days. I drank my wages instead of giving them to her for the housekeeping. I've stopped drinking,
he added.
Since I left. That's helped. It's easier to hold on to my temper.
That's good, Anna said. It was a good sign, both that he hadn't struck his wife, she believed him about that, and that he'd done something to mend his ways other than just wish to be better.
Some people, I think, shouldn't drink. For some it's all right, but it takes different people differently.
Yes, I think that's true. After a couple of times, after I'd given it up for a while, I tried having just one or two, and I learned it's better for me not to. But
he picked up the coat, examining another seam.
Even without the drinking, I haven't always managed to control my temper.
I've heard,
he said quietly. Mr. Bates nodded.
I figured he would have told you.
It was William, as a matter of fact, she said. Thomas only mentioned you'd done something that suggested you had strong feelings about me, and that William saw it.
Mr. Bates looked thoughtful for a moment.
If that's what he took away from that, sometimes I really wonder about his life.
So do I. As you can imagine, I didn't take it as much of a recommendation.
No, I've never... Just so you know, I've never raised a hand to a woman. It's no excuse, but in the army and other places I've been, you get used to a rougher way of dealing with things.
In prison, he meant. And I could believe it.
It was wrong of me,
Mr. Bates went on.
Even if he had been leading you up the garden path, which is what I thought, it was wrong of me.
If he had been, I can fight my own battles, thank you.
Yes, I know.
He sighed.
The truth is, he reminds me of her, Vera. The sly little comments, the underhandedness, the constant air of superiority and self-pity. I used to think, or hope, that when she came to expect kindness and joy out of life, her icy exterior would melt and reveal something finer underneath.
His tone was slightly self-mocking.
But just because she turned out to be rotten the whole way through, doesn't mean he is.
That would explain why he was so reluctant to give Thomas a chance. Nobody wanted to be the same fool twice. Half wanting, half dreading to hear more about Mr. Bates's disastrous marriage, she resolutely turned the conversation to the safer topic of talking about their colleague.
I do think he's improving a bit.
A bit,
Mr. Bates admitted.
He still gets under my skin, though, making William sit up all night waiting for him while his mother's dying and he's out carousing.
He shook his head.
About that,
Anna hesitated.
I'm not entirely sure that he didn't think, in some way, that was helpful.
How?
You know William was worried about leaving us all in the lurch, and Thomas especially. Mr. Carson practically had to order him to go.
William is very conscientious, yes. And don't tell me Thomas will be holding it over his head before Mr. Mason is cold in the ground.
Well, that's the point. I think what he was trying to say is that William would have paid off the debt up front and not to worry about it.
Mr. Bates's expression was skeptical.
Wouldn't it be a lot simpler not to call it a debt in the first place, if he really wanted to help?
I'm not sure he entirely understands.
How to put it?
That the rest of us aren't keeping score all the time. I mean, the way he asked for my help with arranging about going to Kew Gardens.
She shook her head.
How did he ask?
I thought at first I was being blackmailed. He came up with... It's not important what he came up with. And then said, so here's what it'll take to keep me quiet. And asked for a perfectly ordinary favour that we'd already done for other people.
Well, not exactly,
Mr. Bates pointed out.
But what did he... I don't mean to pry, but I hope he isn't going to make trouble about whatever it is.
I don't think he will.
She shouldn't have brought it up, but now they were so close to the subject.
It was something about someone I care about who had done something that other people might look down on if they only knew part of the story.
I see. But you think you have the whole story?
I have quite a bit of it,
she admitted. More than she had before this morning, in fact. Mr. Bates looked at her levelly.
You don't?
His voice broke on the final word. In for a penny, in for a pound.
Yes, it's you. And yes, it's what you're thinking. Unless you've got two entirely separate dark secrets. I know where you've been, I know you didn't do it, and I think you're an idiot for taking the blame, but I understand why you thought you had to.
Mr. Bates appeared to deflate before her eyes.
I'm sorry, You shouldn't be burdened with a secret if you feel you have to disclose it.
It's not my secret to tell, Anna said, and Thomas will keep his mouth shut because he thinks he's got to for you to keep quiet about his dark secret.
Which half the house knew anyway, but Thomas seemed to be ignoring that part of what she'd said.
But I thought that perhaps his lordship knew already.
He doesn't. It's no way to repay his kindness, taking me on even though I'm a cripple, but he doesn't.
So Thomas had been right about that. Don't you think with everything you've been through together, he might understand?
He might understand in a sense, but I don't see how he could keep me on. I should hand in my resignation. I shouldn't have come in the first place, but...
If you want my opinion, I think you ought to tell him,
Anna said before he could get any more melodramatic.
If Thomas can find out, somebody else can, and it'll be better coming from you. If you're serious about resigning, it makes more sense to tell him, since the worst he can do is sack you. But that's just what I think.
If it were Thomas she was speaking to, she'd likely have to lay out in so many words that she wasn't telling him to tell his lordship before she did, but Mr. Bates could take hint.
How did Thomas find out?
He wrote to a friend of his in the army to find out what you meant about having been married. He asked me if I wanted him to. I said no, and he did it anyway, she added. I'm not sure what he might have been thinking about doing with the information, but what he did do was bring it straight to me.
Mr. Bates nodded.
I see. I noticed a distance between us since just before we came down to London. You see me differently. Of course you do. I am married and a convict, and I shouldn't be troubling you with my company.
That isn't why, she blurted out. Not exactly.
Oh?
Thomas's friend also wrote that there are rumors in the regiment that you'd been violent with your wife. I could love a divorced man. I could love a man who's been to prison for something he didn't do. But I couldn't love a man who beat his wife. I couldn't risk it. I couldn't allow myself to.
Of course,
Mr. Bates murmured. And now they were in for a pound, she might as well go the whole guinea.
And the truth is, I find it very difficult to spend time with you without falling in love, at least a little. But as those rumors are completely untrue...
Not completely,
Mr. Bates said quietly.
I didn't beat her, but I didn't treat her well. But I would never... But that's beside the point, because I'm not divorced.
That's a thing that could change, she pointed out. Will she really want to stay married forever to a man who can't stand her and won't live with her?
She might,
Mr. Bates warned.
If it's to her advantage, or if she thinks it's to my disadvantage.
Suppose she meets someone else. It wouldn't be to her advantage then.
It could happen. It was considerably likelier than anything happening so that Thomas and Mr. Fitzroy could be together.
True. Anything is possible.
All right then, Anna said with a firm nod. And unless and until we'll carry on being very good friends. Agreed?
I like that very much,
said Mr. Bates. As Thomas expected, he didn't have a moment to himself after William had gone, while the amount of actual work required when the household wasn't entertaining and they were out for meals more often than not wasn't much of a strain for two footmen, but with no one to switch off jobs with, it wore on him pretty quickly. The whole point of a footman was to be seen, adding to the grandeur of the house while simultaneously not drawing any attention to yourself. You weren't doing anything more complicated than opening a door or setting out more toast, but you had to do it at the exact moment it was required, not before or after, and always appear completely unruffled. That meant that Thomas was spending the greater part of each day on display, waiting for the moments where he would be called upon to do something. It started with serving at breakfast, the one meal that they always took at home. That was mostly a matter of standing by the sideboard like a particularly large vase, but you couldn't drift off into your own private thoughts lest you miss someone signaling for more tea or commit a facial expression. Next came the calling hours from just after the upstairs breakfast was cleared to a bit before tea time. At Downton, those times of day were usually when you got to sit in the servants' hall and catch your breath a bit, unless her ladyship had put out word that she was at home to callers, which didn't happen above once a month or so. London was a different story, with a constant trickle of calling cards and invitations turning up. With 2 footmen, you'd switch off minding the door during that time, so you each got a bit of a break. Or if Carson sent one of them out on an errand, that at least made a change of scenery, and you could usually manage any small purchases you needed for yourself while you were at it. With William gone, Carson assigned any errands to Bates or the hall boys, depending on how much walking and how much money was involved, and Thomas was essentially chained to the front door. He was allowed to go downstairs to grab a bite of lunch, but even then he had to jump and run upstairs if anyone rang the bell. What made it particularly infuriating was that none of the callers had any expectation whatsoever of so much as setting eyes on the ladies they were presumably calling upon. The whole point was simply to leave their cards on a silver salver that Thomas held out to receive them. It would have been a great deal less trouble for everyone if they had simply put the cards in the post, but that wasn't the way it was done. Sometimes they even had their footman do it, which only added an additional layer of absurdity to the whole thing. An invitation could correctly be delivered by a footman, but if he was dropping off a calling card, it was necessary to maintain a pretense that the lady paying the call was at least nearby. Something that had probably been at least a bit more plausible in the days of closed carriages than open motor cars. Still, you could usually get half a minute or so of conversation out of those occasions, which was what passed for excitement in the mind-numbing drudgery of hall duty. Once it was Syl bringing Lady M's card and a vaguely believable story about her being ill and unable to make the call herself. Lady M was healthy as an ox, but old enough to use that excuse, and she wielded it like a sword and buckler. "I'm not sure I've ever seen you in livery before," Thomas observed, holding out the salver for Syl to put the cards in. "It suits you." "A heck of a lot better than the evening gown, at any rate." "Ah!" Syl said. He leaned in. "Have you had a chance to see Peter since?" Thomas shook his head. That rankled more than anything. He wasn't used to thinking much about Peter between their occasional meetings, but now that they had said what they had said, Thomas found himself full of the same desire to see him that had marked the early stages of his juvenile love affairs. But those, even with Philip, had also held the promise, empty as it turned out to be, of being the beginning of a whole new life. He'd recklessly skived off and sneaked out at every opportunity, believing, wrongly, that if he were caught and sacked, it would only mean an even earlier beginning to his marvelous future. Now he knew there was nothing Peter could do for him if he got sacked. Indeed, it would only jeopardize the meager plans they'd been able to make. But he still wanted to see him. "I don't imagine I will," he said. "Our other footman's gone. His mother's dying. I can't get away." "Sorry," Syl said. He glanced over his shoulder at the chauffeur waiting in the road. "Gotta go." He darted off, and Thomas sank back into torpor. If only her ladyship would send him out with some cards to deliver. It would seem like a holiday at the seaside at this point. Immediately after the calling hours came tea. This, in London, was also an occasion for visiting, but this time the participants in the visit actually saw each other. The ladies were out for tea as often as they were in, but since it was acceptable for young ladies to go to tea without their mothers, it was a rare day when none of them were home for it. And those that were home usually had guests who had to be let in the door, announced in the drawing room, and waited on when they got there. After tea, the upstairs lot usually had a bit of a rest to fortify themselves for the evening's activities. Thomas, after gulping his own tea, usually spent that time washing and drying the silver and glassware from luncheon. Normally, whoever wasn't on duty in the hall would have taken care of it at some point during the afternoon, but now, since he was on his own, it was usually left for him, since he had, after all, been doing essentially nothing all day. If the family were all out for dinner, there was a bit of a respite after the washing up, But if even one of them was dining in, that task rolled straight into laying the table for dinner and then serving it. Carson unbent so far as to allow the maids to carry some of the sauces and side dishes from the kitchen to the servery, but Thomas still had to take them into the dining room, clear it all away after they were done, and of course, wash the silver and glassware again. At that point, he was about ready to fall over dead, but if they were going out in the evening, someone had to be ready to open the door when they got back, and that was always Thomas. It wasn't digging coal or anything, a point Bates made more than once, but it did make for long and frustrating days during which you couldn't relax but also didn't accomplish anything whatsoever. And all the while, Peter was a few streets away but might as well have been on the moon, for all the good it did him. Then, as if that wasn't all enough, on Thursday Carson announced at the servants' dinner that Mr. Bates was taking his half-day the next day, and Thomas would need to dress his lordship. It was all he could do not to scream.
All you have to do,
Bates said patronizingly when Thomas confronted him about it on their way up to the attics to sleep,
is get him into his evening dress. He'll wear the same clothes on to the theater. I'll have everything ready, and I'll be back before he is to put him to bed. It'll take you 10 minutes.
I know how to do it, Thomas snapped.
Then what are you carrying on about?
Because it's the 10 minutes in the day I could sit down and smoke a goddamn cigarette, Thomas informed him. And I'm not carrying on.
Yes, you...
Bates visibly reined himself in.
Never mind. You've had your half-day, and I'm having mine, whether you like it or not. Is there anything within reason that I might do to make you feel it's less of an imposition?
That set Thomas back on his heels a moment. Of course, Bates was going to have his half-day, and even Thomas didn't really begrudge it to him, even if it meant losing one of the few moments during the day that he could count on no one making any demands of him. And there wasn't anything Bates could do about it. No, really. No, he said, his voice sounding sullen even through his own ears. I don't suppose there is.
Then you're just going to have to live with it.
Well, I wasn't planning to slit my wrists over it, Thomas pointed out and went to bed. But the next day, after lunch, when he was settling in for the afternoon period of standing in the front hall waiting for someone to ring the doorbell, Bates appeared. What? Thomas asked irritably.
I'm getting ready to leave, but if you want, I can watch the door for 10 minutes while you go and smoke a cigarette.
Thomas regarded him suspiciously. Mr. Carson's going to wonder why I'm down there. The whole point of the time when the upstairs lot were getting dressed was that there wasn't anywhere else he was supposed to be, and it was no one's business what he did.
Take it or leave it,
Bates said. Well, if you put it like that, I'll take it, thanks. Thomas half expected that Mr. Carson would be waiting at the bottom of the stairs to demand to know where he thought he was going, but the coast was clear. Miss O'Brien was in possession of the servants' hall, naturally, but it was a decent enough day out, and he found an old vegetable crate to sit on by the back door, and nobody interrupted him. He used the time to idly imagine that Peter might happen by. He'd written to explain the situation with William, and now he wanted to see him but couldn't slip away, and Peter had responded that he'd look for any excuse to come this direction, and use the alley behind Grantham House when he did. It wasn't particularly likely they'd manage to meet up that way, but there was always hope. When he got back to the front hall, though, he came out of the door to the servants' stairs just as Mr. Carson was coming out of the drawing room.
Thomas,
he said, practically growling with disapproval.
Where have you been?
Absolutely nothing in this life was free, was it? He opened his mouth to say something about feeling a bit ill when Bates said,
I'm sorry, Mr. Carson, it's my fault. Thomas wasn't sure when he'd get a break, what with having to dress his lordship tonight, so I said I'd keep an eye on things here for a few minutes if he wanted to have one now.
Oh, for pity's sake, of all the things for him to say, why did it have to be the truth? That was just handing Carson an opportunity to spend the rest of the day harping on how lazy Thomas was.
I see,
said Carson.
Thomas is certainly aware, and so should you be, that it is not entirely correct for a valet to answer the door.
Yes, Mr. Carson, they both said.
But I suppose as we are reduced to a single footman at the moment, allowances must be made. Very well, but next time, ask me first.
They both guessed Mr. Carson again, and Bates took off, Carson following him after one more bump in Thomas's direction. Honestly, if it wouldn't get him sacked, he'd cry. Several hours later, when they were up in the dressing room, and Thomas would have cheerfully murdered anyone on earth except Peter for a cigarette, his lordship had the unmitigated gall to ask,
"How are you managing with William away? I hope it isn't a nuisance."
"I'm managing, my lord," he answered as calmly as he could, fastening the strap at the back of his waistcoat. "Sometimes I feel as though I should be 2 places at once, but I'm managing." His lordship looked over his shoulder at him. Thomas braced himself for a scolding, but his lordship said,
"I'll speak to Carson about making sure you get some time off once we're back in the country."
"That's kind of you, my lord." Basically pointless, but kind of him to think of it.
"I'm sure it's not as much fun as having time off in London, but Miss Mason didn't choose this time to die just to inconvenience us."
There was the scolding. "No, my lord, I'm sure she didn't." He sighed and raised his chin for Thomas to tie his tie.
"Has there been any news about her?"
"Not that I know of, my lord, but if he wrote to one of the others I might not have heard, because he was in the front hall or the dining room every hour God sent."
"I'm sure it's dreadful for him, but I've caught myself a time or two wondering if she is in fact actually going to die this time," he admitted. "But that's dreadfully unworthy of me, so please don't repeat it."
"Of course not, my lord." Thomas had had that thought himself, much more than a time or two, and it usually took the form of, she had better actually die this time. He was reasonably ashamed of thinking it, but also thought that if it was him running off to his mother's deathbed every 10 minutes, everyone would be wondering out loud whether he had ever actually had a mother at all. He finished tying the tie and stepped back. "None of us can help what we think, can we?"
"I suppose not."
His lordship held out his arms for his evening coat to be put on.
"If he's somehow not back in time for the garden party, we'll get someone temporary."
Oh, God, the garden party. Thomas hadn't even thought about that. The moment they got back to Downton, they were going to be polishing every tray they had, ironing acres of tablecloths. There wasn't any real chance of him getting that time off his lordship had mentioned, at least until it was over, and by that point, everyone would have forgotten all about it.
"That would be a help, my lord."
Walking down the stairs to the drawing room with Cora, Robert asked her,
"Have you noticed if Thomas might be a little overworked, with William gone for so long?"
Cora tilted her head to one side.
"I can't imagine that he is.
O'Brien says he's complaining of a storm, but there isn't really that much for him to do. We aren't entertaining, after all."
Robert didn't put much stock in anything O'Brien said. Bates had told him that for some reason she and Thomas were no longer in cahoots. But there was no point in having that argument with Cora again.
"Bates mentioned he seems to be feeling a bit of a strain."
"Well," Cora said, "I won't say I told you so."
Yes, this was precisely the sort of situation, and it would be beneficial to have a valet who could fill in as a footman.
"You're just it,"
Robert pointed out. They reached the bottom of the stairs. "Say something to Carson if you think there's anything in it," Cora suggested. "He'll know." When they entered the drawing room, Carson was there, and the girls weren't, so Robert did as she said. Carson drew himself up a little and said,
"I shouldn't think so, my lord. Has he complained?"
"No,"
Robert said. "He hasn't," despite Robert practically inviting him to do so. Bates had also suggested that giving Thomas a chance to grumble a little might cheer him up a bit. Instead, Thomas had said exactly what he ought to have said.
"Keep an eye on the situation, and I think he's owed a bit of time off once things return to normal."
"Very good, my lord."
After addressing his lordship, Thomas raced back down the stairs. Carson was looking after them in the drawing room, so there was just enough time to have a cigarette before starting the dinner service. Though he had to smoke it so quickly, he was a little lightheaded going up the stairs with the soup. Almost immediately after he'd served it and taken up his post by the sideboard, Lady Sybil said,
"Mama, do we have to go back home on Tuesday?"
"Yes, we do," her ladyship said, "because we have the garden party not long after we get back, and we need to get ready for it."
"How much getting ready is there to do, really?" Lady Mary asked.
For her, not much, Thomas guessed, but the rest of them couldn't leave until the family did, and they had plenty to do.
"But Imogene's ball is that night," Lady Sybil said. "I hate to miss it. She came to mine, and it's only one more day."
More likely 2. They'd have to make an early start in the morning to make it to Yorkshire by a decent hour, and the ball wouldn't finish until about 3 a.m. Her ladyship showing no sign of bending, Lady Sybil and Lady Mary turned to his lordship. Lady Edith gave a little jump as though kicked under the table by his sister. Thomas had had a sister once, he knew the signs, and said, "I would very much like to go too, Papa." His lordship, having just taken a sip of wine, set his glass down with a little more force than was strictly necessary. "We'll see." Judging from the smiles on the girls' faces, they knew just as well as Thomas did that he couldn't stand up to his daughters when they all ganged up on him. He was in for 5, maybe even 6 more days of drudgery, to be immediately followed by extra drudgery with a change of scenery. He swore under his breath the whole way down the stairs for the next course. 3 more courses later, it was a simple dinner. It was finally over, and they barely went into the drawing room long enough to so much as look at the coffee tray before heading out to whatever it was they were doing. After closing the door behind them, Thomas allowed himself a moment to lean his forehead against the wall.
"Thomas!" He jumped. "I'm sorry, Mr. Carson,
He couldn't really think of an excuse.
Are you ill?" "No, Mr. Carson." "Then, if you feel the need to engage in theatrics, please do it downstairs."
He went downstairs. Supper was cold meat. Miss Trout apparently felt it was too hot to do any more cooking, but it still perked him up a bit. Not quite enough for him to face the rest of the evening with any real enjoyment, but enough that he could manage to avoid anything that Mr. Carson might consider theatrics. He was lingering over his pudding at the servants' hall table, trying to put off the moment when he'd have to go up to the servery and start washing the silver and glassware again, when Carson said,
"Thomas, if you are that tired, you may go to bed."
Now that woke him the rest of the way up. What, not do the washing up? He didn't know why he was asking that. If there was a chance of getting out of the house, he'd do a mountain of washing up in the morning.
"I will supervise the hall boys as they do it,"
Carson said.
"This once."
This was unprecedented. He thought quickly, calculating his chances of getting out the door unseen. With Miss O'Brien hindering instead of helping, they were about nil. And he wasn't about to try going out the attic window again. He'd almost broken his neck the time he'd done it to me. Whoever it had been. George Viscount Hargreaves, probably. The only thing for it was to press his luck. "Can I go get a pint?"
"No," said Carson. "If you are not tired, you could work."
Damn. Well, there was one more thing he might try.
"What about a walk? I've been cooped up in this house for days, Mr. Carson. I'd like a bit of fresh air, that's all."
Carson looked at him levelly.
"Half an hour. If you go anywhere, it would shame this house for your livery to be seen. I will skin you alive, and the silverware and glassware will be waiting for you when you get back."
Deal! Thomas was out the back door before Carson could change his mind. He was bound, of course, for Sir Henry's house, but that wasn't a place he could disgrace the house by being seen. He was pretty sure Lady Denham had left her card at some point. It was only when he was actually there that he began to wonder how he was going to get from standing in the back alley to actually seeing Peter. He was still thinking about it when the kitchen maid came out to dump a bucket of scraps into the ash can. "What do you want, then?" she demanded.
I'm a friend of Mr. Fitzroy's. I was hoping to see him for a minute, if he's not busy."
What the hell, telling the truth had worked out well for him twice in as many days. "I'll see," she said. A moment later, Peter came out. "Oh, God, I was hoping it was you," he said, rushing up to Thomas and then stopping, carefully just out of reach.
"It's me,"
Thomas said, suddenly awkward.
"Managed to slip my shackles for a few minutes."
Thomas glanced over at the house.
"Look, I'm really glad to see you, but we better not make a habit of this." "I know," Thomas said quickly, "and I couldn't if I wanted to. We're leaving soon, and I practically had to beg to be out here now. I know," Peter said. "Here." He took out a pack of cigarettes and offered them to Thomas. Thomas wished he'd light one for him. They couldn't kiss, couldn't touch, but at least that. But of course he couldn't, not when anyone from the house might see. "Thanks," he said, taking one. "There, just 2 normal blokes having a smoke." Peter lit his own cigarette and handed Thomas his silver lighter.
"Keep it,"
he said suddenly.
"What?"
Thomas asked, pausing with the flame halfway to his cigarette. "Keep it, and don't you dare make fun of me. Whenever you have one, it'll be me lighting it for you."
"All right,"
Thomas said.
"And I wouldn't make fun of you. That might be the most romantic thing anyone's ever said to me."
He tried to think of something he had that he could plausibly give Peter. He didn't have a lighter, and he didn't wear his watch in his livery. His cigarette case had been a gift from some other lover. He tried hard to forget which one so he could still enjoy using it, which was not in very good taste, but it would have to do. He took it out of his pocket and gave it to Peter. "Here, swapsies, but actually I need the cigarettes back. These are my last ones, and God knows when I'll be able to buy more." "I'm going to go ahead and consider that the most romantic thing anyone's ever said to me," Peter continued, "but I'm making allowances for you being you." Pocketing the case, he took his own cigarettes back out of his pocket and handed Thomas the pack. "Take these. I've got more left than you have." Thomas took them. "Thanks." "I've been thinking," Peter said. "Thinking what?" "Christmas. I never take Boxing Day, and you don't either, do you?" Thomas shook his head. He hadn't when he and Peter had both worked for Lady Waterstone, and nothing had changed. "It would be a good chance for both of us to get a little time off, don't you think? We'll say we're happy to cover for everyone else on the day itself, but we want another day somewhere around then." Thomas thought it over. "That might work. There's usually a couple days in there between Christmas and New Year's when not much is happening." It was a long way off. 5 months. But at least it was sooner than next summer. "Am I coming here, or are you going there?" "I don't know yet. Sometimes he goes to Devonshire for Christmas. If we can both get a day and a night, we can meet somewhere in the middle. Find a hotel that's not too expensive." "An entire night with a bedroom all to themselves?" "Good idea," he said quickly. "Let's do that." The ones that went home for Boxing Day usually left after the family's dinner on Christmas Day and weren't required to be back until breakfast on the 27th. You might even be able to add a few hours on to that by taking a different day from everyone else. "It's a date," Peter said. He took a drag from his cigarette and added, "Unless we're at war by then." He didn't seem to be joking. "Did something else happen?" Thomas had barely had a chance to look at the newspaper since William had left. "Yeah. Austria just drew a line under Serbia's feet and dared them to step across it," Peter said. "Technically, they could be at war tomorrow night if Serbia doesn't knuckle under." "Tomorrow? Bloody Elliot, take your eyes off world affairs for a week!" Peter shrugged. That was the deadline. Serbia's stalling for time, though, and even if they do, it'll take a while before we get roped into it. "They'll get it sorted out," Thomas said with the confidence he didn't feel. "I hope so." Peter tossed down his cigarette and stomped it out. Thomas took one last drag from his and did the same before the dog end could burn his fingers. "I'd better get back." Peter nodded. "Christmas?" "Christmas," Thomas agreed. They looked at each other for a moment, nodded, and parted. Even with the depressing news from Europe, Thomas found that having seen Peter, even so briefly, put a bit of a spring into his step as he returned to Grantham House. He almost didn't mind the pile of washing up that was waiting for him. He did, however, mind the way that Mr. Carson took out his pocket watch and checked it the moment Thomas came in. Carson knew, as well as anyone, that he wouldn't be carrying his own, and it didn't make any real difference whether he was late or not. But he must not be, because Carson didn't have anything to say about it. When Thomas came back from his walk and went up to the servery, Anna changed into her work apron and joined him. They hadn't really had a chance to talk since their day out with Mr. Fitzroy and Liesel. Thomas was barely in the servants' hall, and when he was, everyone else was too. Particularly Miss O'Brien. "I'll try, if you like," she offered, picking up a towel. Thomas shot her a suspicious glance, but said only, "If you don't mind." She knew better than to expect a thank you. Drying a glass, she said, "So?
"What?"
Did you see him?"
"For about a minute."
"That was what you were after, wasn't it?"
she asked. Thomas did not, as far as she knew, take much of an interest in walking.
"Shout it so the whole house can hear, why don't you?"
he asked, even though she'd barely been speaking above a whisper. Ignoring his rudeness, she said,
"He seems really nice."
"Nice enough to put up with me, you mean?"
She ignored that too.
"I'm happy for you, really."
"There's nothing to—"
The denial seemed almost to be some sort of reflex. He put the glass he was washing back in the water and leaned back to peer through the half-open door to the kitchen stairs.
"All right, we're going to try to see a bit more of each other. Is that what you wanted to hear?"
If it were anyone else, those words would mean that they were headed towards an engagement. She wasn't entirely sure what it meant in Thomas's case. Good. Another glance at the door, and he dried off his hands and reached into his pocket.
Look, he gave me his lighter.
He held it out for her to look at it. It was a perfectly ordinary patent cigarette lighter, made out of some silvery metal, tin probably, or aluminum, and slightly scratched. She supposed he'd get a lot of use out of it, but wondered if the gesture had any particular meaning for people like him and Mr. Fitzroy. Probably. It wasn't as though Mr. Fitzroy could give him a lock of his hair. Or was she meant to exclaim over it like it was an engagement ring? She had settled on saying, "It's nice," in an enthusiastic voice. Thomas seemed satisfied at any rate. He put it back in his pocket and got back to washing the glasses. They washed and dried in something like companionable silence for a bit.
Mr. Bates and I had a bit of a chat as well.
She couldn't tell anyone else. They didn't have a proper understanding, just an understanding that if circumstances changed, they might have an understanding. But Thomas knew what that was like.
Oh,
he said.
Yes, he's trying to get her a divorce. She's refusing so far, but that could change.
All right, Thomas said slowly. Perhaps he didn't quite understand yet.
And if it did, that would change things for us.
Oh, Thomas said in a tone of one enlightened.
I see.
He handed her a silver serving spoon.
What about the other thing?
There were at least 2 other things he could be talking about, but she said,
"We talked about that as well. I told him what I'd heard, and he told me how it all happened."
Sort of. As much as she needed to know. Thomas looked straight at her for a moment. If he says that she's the most awful witch that ever lived and drove him to beat her, I should run the other way.
So that was the part of it he meant. It wasn't as much of a surprise as it might have been if he'd realized that Mr. Bates' treatment of his wife was a larger problem than his prison time. Most women would understand, and the hints she'd had from Mr. Fitzroy and Liesel suggested that Thomas learnt the same hard lessons about men that so many women did.
Nothing like that. He says it never quite got that bad, but he admits there was fault on both sides, and he's given up drinking.
It sounded a little thin to her even as she was saying it, though it hadn't felt that way when she'd been talking to Mr. Bates. And Thomas raised a skeptical eyebrow.
"I really don't think there's anything to worry about,"
she said. Thomas put a handful of forks into the soapy water.
Have you got a brother?
He asked suddenly.
"No, why?"
I'm just wondering if it's going to be me that has to sort it out if you're wrong,
Thomas explained. It took Anna a moment to figure out what he was saying, or rather not saying, and when she did, she wasn't sure whether to be offended that he was threatening to beat up Mr. Bates, or touched that he was willing to stand up for her as a brother would. She settled on being mostly exasperated that he couldn't show his affection like a normal person.
"Perhaps if things go well, there will be a happy occasion for you to stand in for the brother I haven't got,"
she suggested. He looked a little startled at that. The next day brought 3 announcements, none of them a particular surprise. First, a telegram came from Mrs. Hughes saying that William's mother had died in the night and the funeral was to be Monday. Second, Mr. Carson told them at the servants' tea that the household would be moving back to Yorkshire on Thursday rather than on Tuesday as planned. Finally, the evening papers said that Austria had cut off diplomatic relations with Serbia and was mobilizing for war. Of the 3, Thomas found the second to be the most pressing concern. The family was dining out that night, so he managed to find time after seeing them off to fume about it to Anna.
"I thought you liked London,"
she said when he paused for breath.
I like it when I can see more of it than this bloody house,
he corrected her.
If they'd send William down after the funeral, it'd be all right, but bet you they won't.
"Are you getting to appreciate him a bit more then?"
Anna asked innocently.
I never said he didn't have his uses,
Thomas answered.
If they want one footman to do the work of 2, they'd be better off hiring an octopus.
Or a valet who could fill in as footman, but he decided not to say that.
"Should I even bother to mention that I've been doing the work of 3 ladies' maids the whole time we've been here?"
Thomas hadn't really thought about it that way before.
You always do,
he pointed out.
"They don't change their clothes nearly as often in the country as they do here. Nor stay out as late. If you ought to be an octopus, I should be a centipede."
I wonder if they think Miss O'Brien ought to be helping you,
Thomas mused. She'd done for the girls with the help of the housemaid on the previous London seasons and hadn't liked it one bit. Chance would be a fine thing, Anna said. Her ladyship has sent her over to lend a hand a few times when the dresses are particularly complicated, but somehow she always manages to arrive just as I'm doing the last one.
What a coincidence,
Thomas said. Anna laughed. We shouldn't complain too much, though, she said. If they didn't have work for us to do, they'd have no reason to pay us, and then where would we be? Anna could be a real wet blanket sometimes. But Peter could be like that too. Perhaps there was some sort of trade-off between reliability and wet-blanketedness when it came to friends. The next day after church, Carson announced that he would see Thomas and Mr. Bates in his pantry. Thomas couldn't begin to imagine why. He hadn't had time to get up to any trouble, much less any trouble involving Bates. He looked inquiringly at Bates as they went, but got only a shrug in return.
I have decided, Carson said, after much consideration, that I will be returning to Downton on Wednesday morning to open the house for the family and begin preparations for the garden party.
Oh. Now that Thomas thought about it, on previous London visits, the first footman had been sent back the day ahead. He wasn't sure whether he was getting the better end of the deal or not, with Carson going instead.
It is not ideal, Carson continued, but I don't see any way around it. William will also be returning on Wednesday, but he is not sufficiently experienced to handle things on his own, and there is no point in sending him down on one train while Thomas goes up on another. I will therefore be relying upon the two of you to oversee the departure.
Now Thomas wasn't sure whether to be offended that Carson didn't trust him to do it on his own, or glad that he wasn't expected to.
His lordship and her ladyship have very kindly offered to keep things as simple as possible on a Wednesday. They will receive no callers, luncheon will be a cold collation served from the sideboard, tea will be as usual, and they will dine with Lady Painswick and return early in the evening. During this time, Mr. Bates may answer the door if necessary.
Yes, Mr. Carson, they both said.
On Thursday morning, breakfast will be laid at 7:30 and removed promptly at 9. Her ladyship has stated that if the young ladies are still lingering over their breakfasts at this point, you may remove their plates from in front of them. You would not do so. You may instead remind them of the necessity of being at the railway station for the 11 o'clock train, should it be required.
Yes, Mr. Carson, said Thomas.
Mr. Bates, you will handle the tickets for both the staff and family, ensure that all staff are on the train in good time, and work with Anna and Miss O'Brien to see that the family have everything they need during the journey. Yes, Mr. Carson,
Bates said.
Thomas, you will make sure that all of the family and household baggage makes it to the train and off again. We'll do as much of the household packing as we can before I leave, and the heavy baggage will go up with me, but you'll have to see to the things that they will be using on the last day.
Typical. Bates looked after the family, while Thomas took care of the bags. If it were him and William doing the work, it would be the other way around. Yes, Mr. Carson.
Do you have any questions about what is expected of you?
No, Mr. Carson, they both said. Once they were back in the corridor, with Carson's door closed behind them, Bates said,
I felt like I was back in the army for a minute there.
He gets like that, Thomas said. If Bates filled in as third footman for large parties, he'd know.
Well, if you catch me starting to salute, tread on my foot or something.
The next 2 days were, if anything, even worse than the ones before, because every minute that Thomas wasn't standing in the dining room or the front hall, he was packing away silver, china, glassware, and table linens, or unpacking them again when Carson decided that he still needed something. Only the best sets travelled back and forth between Downton Abbey and Grantham House with the family, but the things that were staying in London still had to be carefully stowed away. The silver in treated flannel bags, the china stacked with felt, the crystal in divided crates, and all of it in the precise cupboard or chest where Carson wanted it. Meanwhile, the quality of the meals in the servants' hall, already poor under Miss Trout, declined precipitously as she tried to use things up so it won't go to waste. Throughout it all, Thomas held out hope that Carson might go to his club on Tuesday evening while the family were at the ball. He still wouldn't be able to get out of the house, not without William to cover for him, but at least he'd get a break. But on the evening itself, Carson decided his time would be better spent repacking some glassware that was going up on the train with him, which he had decided might not be wrapped securely enough. When he escaped to the servants' hall, everyone was talking about how Austria had declared war on Serbia.
Do you suppose we'll end up in it?
Anna asked, nodding towards the headline of the newspaper Mr. Bates was reading.
I hope not,
said Mr. Bates gravely.
One of Thomas's friends was saying last week that if they did go to war, it was nearly certain we'd be drawn in.
Is he in a position to know?
Mr. Bates asked.
It's the one who's a governess,
Anna explained.
I gather she's been following things very closely, so she can explain it to the children she teaches. And because she's Swiss, she told us about all the treaties and agreements that led from Serbia back to us.
The details had become hopelessly muddled in Anna's mind, but Liesel had seemed to know what she was talking about. Mr. Bates nodded.
If it ends quickly, we might escape it. But Germany's spoiling for a fight. It won't end quickly if they have anything to say about it.
Thomas's friend's employer has told him he must enlist if we go to war.
I thought he looked paler than usual when he saw the news,
Mr. Bates said, meaning Thomas, Anna supposed, since he'd never seen Mr. Fitzroy.
Poor devil. Both of them.
Indeed, Anna couldn't imagine how she'd feel if Mr. Bates was going. She felt a guilty sense of relief that he was lame. There was no chance he'd be called back to the army.
Lord Grantham won't force anyone to go,
Mr. Bates continued.
Not after the things we saw in South Africa. The things we had to do in South Africa.
Anna hoped he was right. For the rest of the evening, talk centered mostly on the coming war, brothers and sweethearts who might have to go. It was a shock when the family came home from the ball and Anna went up to undress the girls, to hear them talking lightly of gowns and who had danced with whom. Lady Mary did seem a bit distracted, though. She told Anna to start with the others, then sat at the dressing table toying with her necklace, only occasionally interjecting a scathing comment on some other young lady's dress or choice of dance partners. As Anna was finishing up with Lady Edith, Lady Mary began taking down her own hair. Anna tried to hurry. Lady Mary might mean to help, but it was more likely she'd end up making things more difficult. Just as Anna was on her way over to her, Lady Mary started to take off her necklace. "Oh, drat," she said, putting it back around her neck. "My hair's gotten stuck in the clasp." Anna wasn't sure what she expected, taking her hair down on her own, before Anna had had a chance to get her jewels off of her, but she only said,
"I see, my lady. Let's move over nearer the light so I can see to untangle it."
"Don't pull it," Lady Mary said. She stepped away from Anna. "Let's go to my room so you can take your time with it and not keep Edith and Sybil up." True, they were both in their nightgowns, with their hair braided, but they didn't look particularly tired. They were still talking eagerly about the ball. Anna followed Lady Mary across the passage to her bedroom, wondering what was up. Lady Mary sat at the dressing table with her back to the light, so Anna could go to work on her necklace.
"This is really tangled in here," she observed. "I might have to cut a few strands."
"Do what you have to do," Lady Mary said. "The truth is I did it on purpose because there's something I wanted to talk about without the others hearing." She'd suspected as much.
"What is it?"
Anna's first thought was that it was about the war, but it wasn't likely, really. It was probably something to do with a man. "You know I told Matthew I'd give him my answer when we go back."
"Yes, my lady."
Had she chosen someone else then? She hadn't mentioned anyone special. "And I think I want to accept him, but there's something that I think I need to tell him. So I thought I'd tell you, partly in hopes that you can talk me out of it, although I don't think you can, and partly to practice saying it out loud. I hope you don't mind." "What on earth?"
"If you think I can help, then I don't mind."
"It's about the Turkish gentleman, Mr. Pamuk."
"Oh, my lady, I don't see how Mr. Matthew or anyone could hold that against you."
She shook her head, causing the necklace clasp to pull at her hair. "There's a part of it no one else knows, except maybe Thomas, but I'm not sure how much he really saw. He didn't just stumble into my room and have a stroke, and he certainly didn't have a stroke and then stumble into my bedroom. He kissed me, and I let him. I kissed him back. That's what we were doing when he had the stroke." It still didn't sound too serious. Girls of Lady Mary's class weren't supposed to kiss men officially, but most of them did. And I suspected it was forbidden mainly so that there would be a rule they could transgress without real consequences.
"I see. Well, if you only kissed him..."
But that's not all. Not quite. We were... She looked over at the man. We were lying down and kissing.
Oh,
Did he? No, I'm not ruined, but I'm not sure I could prove I haven't been. He put his hand... I see, said Anna quickly. No one knows that part, Lady Mary added. I'd pulled my nightgown back down before Thomas came in, thank heavens. But he was still lying on top of me, dead, or at least unconscious.
Mr. Pamuk, she meant, not Thomas, though for an instant Anna had a truly jarring mental picture.
I think your secret's safe with Thomas, my lady. He's got a secret of his own, as you know.
Good, said Lady Mary. But that isn't the point, really. Even if he takes it to his grave, I have to tell Matthew, don't I? Before I marry him? Anna wasn't sure. At the very least, she might leave out the bit about the nightgown. And the hand.
Well, if you didn't. Actually...
But I would have, if he hadn't died first. There were plenty of women who would have if they had the chance. That was why parents and chaperones were so careful not to give them a chance.
I wouldn't like to marry someone with a secret between us,
Anna finally said.
And I think that if the shoe were on the other foot, I'd respect the other person more for owning up when they didn't have to.
Hadn't Bates, and didn't she love him all the more for it?
If you love someone, you're supposed to love them warts and all. If I found out later that they kept something from me, something they felt was important, that would hurt more. It would hurt even if I didn't really mind that much about the secret itself, if you know what I mean.
I do, said Lady Mary. I know just what you mean, but... She closed her eyes for a moment. Suppose he breaks it off with me, withdraws his proposal.
I suppose if he does, then he's not the right man for you.
If there was someone right for Thomas, then there had to be someone right for Lady Mary. But he is the man who will inherit Downton Abbey, Lady Mary pointed out.
That's true,
said Anna.
There.
She got the necklace free.
But you aren't marrying the house, my lady.
It would be a great deal easier if I were, she said. She shook her head and stood up so Anna could begin undoing her dress. I suppose I must tell him.
It's a decision only you can make, my lady.
She thought of something.
You didn't, begging your pardon, but did you ask him to come to your room?
No, she said. No, he just came.
I would tell him that, I think. That you weren't planning to do something you shouldn't. You just got caught up in a moment.
Do you suppose it makes a difference?
It would to me.
She brought the dress up over Lady Mary's head.
And if you still want to know what I think?
Of course. Go on.
I shouldn't make too much of it if he reacts badly at first. He may feel differently once it's had some time to sink in.
She could easily see Lady Mary storming off and vowing never to speak to him again if the first thing Mr. Matthews said was a bit insensitive. Well, he's off, said Bates. Thomas had not been present at the leave-taking as the young ladies had come down to breakfast just as Carson was making his final preparations, requiring Thomas to go up to the dining room with fresh toast. He was now standing in the servery, waiting to see if they'd need anything else.
Are you ready to steal the great ship, Mr. Barrow?
That's right, he was acting butler now, wasn't he? If he was being honest, and really, why should he start now? He was a little nervous. Mostly because he knew that if anything went wrong, Carson would hold him to blame, whether it was his fault or not.
I wouldn't ask them to call you that,
Bates went on quickly.
You don't want to seem like you're getting ahead of yourself.
No, of course not, Thomas said, and I'm sure I'll manage.
What can I do?
Bates asked.
His lordship's up and dressed, so I'm at your disposal.
Thomas hadn't expected him to volunteer his services so eagerly, and was caught flat-footed for a moment. What couldn't he do that didn't involve carrying things up and down the stairs? We'll be clearing the breakfast in a bit. Why don't you stay up here and keep an ear on the front door and an eye on the hall boys? He decided. I'll go down and supervise them at that end, and we'll just have to hope they don't find any trouble in between. Both of the London hall boys were new to the house and the service, otherwise after William left they could have shoved the taller one into livery and had him take up at least a bit of the slack, standing in the front hall when no one was expected, for instance. Bates tossed off a mock salute. Do you know what goes down and what doesn't? Thomas asked. The Hall boys certainly didn't. That was why they couldn't be trusted to clear the breakfast on their own. That and it didn't see the horseplay.
Yes, unless anything special is going down to be packed.
Good point. 2 of the chafing dishes, Thomas said. They decided on a mostly cold breakfast for the next day, with just 1 hot dish. But not until they've been washed. At that moment, Lady Edith got up from the breakfast table. The other 2 had gone a little while before, so Thomas nipped into the dining room and carried back one of the chafing dishes they had just been talking about. The one that contained sausages, if the young ladies hadn't scoffed them all while he wasn't looking. They had not, and he, after a quick glance at both servery doors, grabbed a fork and speared a sausage. Their breakfast had been ages ago, and he hadn't had much of it with Carson breathing down his neck about various last-minute details. Unofficial perk, he explained in response to Bates' inquiring look.
I see.
He eyed the remaining sausages speculatively. If you want one, have it before I send the Hall boys up, Thomas advised. They're like a horde of locusts when it comes to leftovers. He had reason to be glad later that he'd snatched that sausage because the servants' lunch was even more dismal than the recent standard. It was a sort of casserole that appeared to be made up of what other bits and pieces the cook had scraped out of the corners of the larder. Apart from that, the rest of the day wasn't too bad. The upstairs luncheon went off without a hitch. You never could tell with a cold collation from the sideboard whether it would end up being more trouble than otherwise, with everyone asking if there might be a bit of this or that in the kitchen that could be brought up, but this time they managed to make do with what was on offer. By tea time, the upstairs lot had noticed that there was a war on. As Thomas was serving it, Lady Sybil asked her ladyship, "If we go to war, will Papa have to go away again?" Thomas hadn't thought of that, but his lordship had been in the army. "I shouldn't think so," said her ladyship. "You won't remember, but it was terribly nerve-wracking when he was in South Africa." "I remember," said Lady Edith. His lordship, catching wind of this conversation, said, "If we enter the war, I will do my duty." "But surely they won't send you to fight," her ladyship said. "It would be, I don't know, something in London, or training new recruits." "I'll go when I'm needed." His lordship's tone was final, and the ladies asked no further questions, though her ladyship wore a determined expression. Later, the same question arose at the servants' dinner, served early, just after the family left for Lady Rosamond's, and Thomas was pleased to have the inside scoop. Carson doubtless would have shared no more than his lordship's stated intention to do his duty, but Thomas related her ladyship's views on the matter as well. "I shouldn't wonder she doesn't want him going," said Miss Tander. "You never know what may happen in a war." "I quite agree," said Thomas. "Will you go with him if he goes?" one of the maids asked Bates, "since you were with him in South Africa?"
Bates shook his head. "I'd go if they'd have me, but I don't think they would with my leg the way it is, even if he's in an administrative post, and I agree with her ladyship that that's likely. They'd want his batman to be fit for service."
Lucky old Anna. Shortly after dinner, Miss Tanner began herding the housemaids and hall boys up to bed, reminding them all that it would be an early start tomorrow. Thomas ducked outside for a cigarette. He'd just lit it when Bates of all people joined him. "What now?" Wordlessly, he offered Bates the pack.
"No thanks. Look, we've got at least an hour before they come back. Go and see him."
Was he that obvious? "I can't."
"I can let them in if they come back early,"
Bates said.
"and I won't tell Mr. Carson if that's what you're worried about."
He shook his head. "I can't just turn up at the house where he works. If you think it's bad for a housemaid to have followers hanging round the back door."
"Surely you could get away with it once."
"I already did once." If he'd known he'd have a better opportunity later, he'd not have wasted it, but he had.
"And you can't come up with some way around that."
"Like what?"
"There's a place we go sometimes, but it's not particularly likely he'd be there. He's a champion at sneaking out, but even he doesn't manage it every day." Bates shrugged.
"Go and look. You never know."
He'd have to change his clothes. Even if Carson wouldn't skin him alive, the Criterion wouldn't let him in the door in livery.
"You'll cover for me if they get back?"
"I will. If they even notice, I'll say you were in the middle of some last-minute preparations for tomorrow."
"All right."
Thomas galloped up to his attic room at the speed that would probably have qualified him for the Grand National. As he hurried to the Criterion bar, he reminded himself that As he told Bates, there was no particular reason to think Peter would be there. He didn't usually make it there above once a week. Still, it was a bit of a blow to get to scan the end of the bar and not see him there. He hadn't had time to notice who was there when a vaguely familiar voice said, "Thomas, it is you." It was Kit What's-His-Name again from the other night, and he was at a table with Theo, of all people. "Join us if you're not meeting anyone." Thomas glanced a question at Theo. It was bad form to cut in on someone else's pickup, but he hadn't seen Theo this trip, and if Peter wasn't here, Thomas would as soon talk to him as anyone. Theo nodded minutely, and Thomas said, "I will, thanks," and sat down.
"You're not meeting Peter?"
Theo asked. Thomas shook his head. "I just unexpectedly ended up with a bit of free time. I was hoping he'd be here, but..." He shrugged. "We leave first thing tomorrow."
"Hang on,"
Theo said.
"Excuse me a moment,"
he said to Kit and dashed off to the bar. "Tom," said Kit, watching him go. "I ought to have asked him to get us another round. Oh well, I was wondering if I'd see you again."
"I'm only here for a minute,"
Thomas said. He really didn't want to get in Theo's way on this one. Kit seemed nice, and Theo didn't mind counter-jumpers. They might be able to make a regular thing of it if they hit it off. "Of course, you must be frightfully busy." He said it with a hint of question. Busy doing what? That wasn't very good form either, fishing for personal details. But if he was here more than once, and Theo thought he was all right, Thomas supposed he didn't have to keep everything a secret.
"Another footman had to leave, right after the last time we talked, as a matter of fact. Dying mother. Can't really begrudge him, but it meant I couldn't slip away."
"But why was your footman leaving me?" "Oh," he looked embarrassed. It was clear enough that he hadn't quite realized Thomas was a servant, was in fact one of the tarts at the end of the bar. That explained why he'd been so chummy before and asked Thomas to join him now, even though he'd already picked up Theo. He wouldn't have thought Thomas was gentry, of course, but since Kit was playing at being middle class, he'd be used to palling around with that sort. That had happened a time or two before. Thomas tended to keep his upstairs accent on, unless it was clear the bloke fancied a bit of rough, and Thomas felt like indulging him. "Yeah," he said, deliberately letting a bit of the north into his vowels to ensure there'd be no further confusion. Theo came back. "Drew's going to run and see if he can round up Peter." If Thomas had thought that was a good idea, he had done it himself, but since Drew was already gone, he just said, "Thanks."
"Nah, we's all right," Theo said. "One of the housemaids at Drew's place is sweet on some footman from Peter's. She sends him over there with billet-doux all the time."
Thomas had to admit it was a pretty good cover. If anyone noticed anything, it would be the lovebirds to take the fall.
"Do you have some sort of card file where you keep track of that sort of thing?"
Theo tapped his head.
"All up here. You know, I had several names ready for you, if Lord and Lady G decided they wanted a temporary footman." "Why don't I grab us some more drinks?" Kit suggested. "Yours is whiskey soda, right, Thomas?"
Thomas nodded.
"Duh."
Theo raised an eyebrow behind Kit's departing bag. He knew as well as anyone that Thomas didn't normally play up the working-class lad angle.
"Apparently, he was under the impression I was one of the quality," Thomas explained.
"Oh, you're the only one of us that happens to," Thomas noted. "I almost believe that line you used to spout about being the love child of an Italian count. Honestly, tell one fairy story when you're 16 and you never live it down."
"You don't know it's not true,"
he retorted. Theo couldn't know that because Thomas didn't either. Not for certain, though it was admittedly unlikely. Kit returned with the drinks.
"What are we talking about?"
he asked.
"Nothing,"
Thomas said quickly. "What were you talking about before I showed up?"
"The war,"
Kit said.
"I'd like to go report on it. Plucky Serbian villages holding their own against the invading Austro-Hungarians, that sort of thing. But I can't get an editor to bite. Either they've already got a war correspondent, or they don't see why they need one."
"If we end up joining it, I'm sure they'll change their tune," Thomas pointed out. Kit looked a bit brighter at that.
"True. Speaking of if we join," Theo added, "you'll never guess who's planning to enlist."
"You mean other than Peter?" Thomas asked, not even trying to keep the bitterness out of his tone.
Theo swore. "I'm sorry, I wasn't thinking. He should be alright, though. He was saying he'd try for the medical corps."
"If Sir H is satisfied with it." Kit was looking politely puzzled throughout this exchange, and Theo explained,
"Our friend's employer fancies he'll contribute to the war effort by making his servants enlist."
"Really?" said Kit.
That doesn't seem entirely crooked.
No, said Thomas.
It isn't. He's not the only one that had that idea either, Theo said. But anyway, the one I was talking about who actually wants to go is Syl.
You're kidding, Thomas said.
I'm not.
He was right that Thomas would never have guessed. They continued talking mostly about the war until Peter came in, his face a little flushed from running. Thomas, he said, grabbing one of Thomas's hands in both of his.
I can't stay long.
Nor can I, Thomas told him. Saying a quick goodbye to Kit and Theo, they went to the bar, Peter quickly ordering a drink.
Are you still leaving tomorrow?
He asked. Thomas nodded. Bates is keeping an eye on things at the house.
The Bates. Long John Silver.
He's not as awful as I thought at first, Thomas admitted.
Anna likes him. Good, Peter said. I'm glad that you have friends in the house, especially with what's coming.
He sounded grave, and Thomas nodded. It doesn't look good, does it?
The good news,
Peter said, is that Sir H doesn't mind me going for the medical corps. He's going to talk to some people he knows, and he's sure that with his recommendation they'll have a place for me.
That is good,
Thomas admitted. At least he'd be safe. I don't imagine I'll enjoy it, but with a bit of luck, I won't even have to leave England. I could even be stationed in London.
I bet sneaking out's a lot riskier, though,
Thomas pointed out.
Probably,
Peter nodded.
The bad news, I don't think it's in the papers yet, is that Russia and Germany are mobilizing. Sir H heard it from somebody in his club, a colonel something. That's not unexpected, is it?
Thomas asked. Everyone was saying that Germany would side with Austria, Russia with Serbia.
No, but it's fast,
Peter answered.
It means they're keen to fight. Otherwise they'd hang back and give Austria and Serbia a chance to hash it out on their own.
Oh, Thomas said.
And it means if they're moving that fast, I don't think much of our chances of not being at war by, say, December.
Oh. Well, Thomas said bravely,
you get leave, don't you?
Half of the letters he got from Joey were about what adventures he'd had on leave, and they'd hardly give it to everyone except the medical corps.
Whenever you get it, we'll have Christmas then.
It might be difficult for him to get away without everyone else's Boxing Day as an excuse, but he'd think of something. Sooner than either of them would have liked, Peter had to leave. Sir H was dining at home, and the risk was all too real that he'd decide suddenly to go somewhere afterwards, his club or the theater where his actress worked, and require a change of clothes. Thomas walked in most of the way home, talking of nothing in particular, and parted with a handshake. When Thomas got back to the house, only Bates, Anna, and O'Brien were still up. The latter looked up from her knitting to glare at him as he entered the servants' hall.
I take it they're not back yet?
He asked.
Not yet,
said Anna with a sigh.
Fortunately for you,
O'Brien added. In answer, Thomas leaned back in his chair and very slowly, deliberately, lit a cigarette.
I beg your pardon,
O'Brien said with an expression of injured dignity.
I think you'll find I'm acting butler at the moment, Miss O'Brien,
he pointed out acidly. She opened her mouth to say something, closed it again, repeated the procedure 2 more times, then rummaged in her work basket for her own cigarettes, and even more slowly and deliberately than he had done, lit one. Thomas at least managed not to open and close his mouth like a fish while he was deciding how to respond. Finally, he settled on,
would anyone else like one? Anna?
No, thank you, said Anna. I only smoke a pipe myself. I just think it's more ladylike.
Honestly, he ought to have made friends with Anna ages ago. Anna was more relieved than anything to be back in Yorkshire after more than 3 weeks in London. So the news that she was to return almost immediately to accompany Miss Patmore to have her eyes seen by a specialist wasn't particularly welcome. She understood that Miss Patmore had to have someone with her and was glad to help, but she'd have been even gladder if someone else had been picked. Thomas, of course, didn't see it that way.
You?
He said scornfully.
You barely know your way around London either. Why don't they send me?
Knowing it was only envy that made him spiteful, Anna held on to her patience and said,
She might need help finding the way round the ladies' cloakroom in the station, for one thing.
Oh, Thomas said.
Or if the hospital sends her unmentionables home to be washed through,
You want to do that? All right, I get it, he said. Please no more about Miss Patmore's unmentionables. Anna relented.
I'm a bit nervous about it, really. Lady Rosamond is having a drive of collectors at the station, but apart from that, I'll have to figure it out as I go along. And they said I'm to stay at Lady Rosamond's as well.
Why not Grantham House? Thomas wondered.
I'm not sure.
Privately, Anna suspected that Lord Grantham didn't quite realize that the servants' quarters weren't closed up after the season the way the upstairs was. Miss Danner and the housemaids and hallboys lived there year-round, so for her to stay there would not require reopening the house, as would have to be done if, say, Lady Mary were going.
I don't know any of the staff at Lady Rosamond's, do you?
She brought a lady's maid when she came to Downton, of course, but she seemed to have a new one of those every time. Thomas shook his head.
Well, I hope they're nice.
More to the point, she hoped that if it turned out she needed their help, they didn't think she was enjoying a carefree holiday, as some people evidently did. Still, the next morning, before they left, Thomas shoved a piece of paper into her hand, saying, Here. She unfolded the paper, which bore an address. Peter, he explained. Write to him if you're in a jam. He'll know what to do.
Thank you, she said, genuinely touched. But does he know you're volunteering his services?
I'll write to him, Thomas said, but he won't mind. And indeed, when the evening post was distributed on Anna's second night in Lady Rosamond's servants' hall, the butler handed her an envelope with the return address matching the one Thomas had given her. Dear Anna, the note read, Thomas has informed me that I should be happy to help in any way I can while you are in London with your blind cook. It is entirely within his right to volunteer my services, and always has been, and even if it weren't, I would be pleased to help you in any way that I can. Your words to me in Kew Gardens gave me a great deal to think about, and those thoughts, in turn, led to a development that I believe Thomas has already made known to you. If there is any way I can help, please do not hesitate to write me at once. In fact, I almost hope that some small matter arises in which I may be of some assistance, though nothing that causes serious inconvenience to you or Miss P., because then I would feel less presumptuous in asking you to keep an eye on Thomas, in the event that I am called away, as it looks more likely every day that I will. I don't much like the thought of him being entirely on his own. Your friend, P.F.
As far as Thomas was concerned, the best part about returning to Downton from London was getting to eat Miss Patmore's cooking. So he was very put out to learn that she was leaving for London herself almost as soon as the rest of them got back. Granted, what Miss Bird thought was worth feeding them in the servants' hall was a big step above what Miss Trout had stuck in front of them, at least when Daisy wasn't sabotaging it. But still, he'd be glad when Miss Patmore got back. He didn't mind at first that Anna was going as well, at least not except for feeling that if anybody was going to have a holiday in London with no responsibilities other than getting Miss Patmore to and from the hospital, it ought to have been him. But it didn't take long for him to change his tune when he found himself turning several times a day to say something to someone who wasn't there. He'd found himself doing the same thing when he and O'Brien stopped being friends, and now he didn't even have the consolation of spite. Although he did have the consolation of knowing she would be back, and also Bates, who seemed to believe that he and Thomas formed the core membership of some sort of We Miss Anna society, since they had literally nothing in common aside from being friends with Anna and Bates's weird and disturbing interest in Thomas's private life. Thomas tried to keep their chats Anna-focused. Anna's absence was particularly vexing when word leaked out that her ladyship was in the family way, and everyone was speculating about what it would mean for Lady Mary and Mr. Matthew. Anna would have had the inside scoop and might even have been persuaded to share it with him, but as it was, he knew nothing more than anyone else, namely that they had not made a happy announcement. Then, one afternoon, the day that Germany declared war on Russia, Miss Hughes came into the servants' hall and told Miss O'Brien that Mr. Carson was ready to see her now. That was strange in itself. O'Brien wasn't under Carson's supervision, so they shouldn't have anything private to say to each other. But as she got up from the table, O'Brien smirked at both him and Bates. As soon as she had gone, Thomas turned to Bates and said, "She's up to something." Thomas nodded. "Any idea what?" The only thing he could think of
that involved both of them was Thomas sneaking out on their last night in London and Bates agreeing to cover for him, but that, while certainly something Carson would disapprove of, was not a serious enough offense to justify tale-bearing, which Carson also did not like. Maybe if some emergency had arisen while Thomas was out, especially if it was an emergency that came to the attention of any of the family. But nothing had, and while Thomas wouldn't necessarily have put it past O'Brien to stage one, she could invent something out of whole cloth after the fact. They were left waiting for what seemed a very, very long time. Thomas was surprised that there were no glaciers forming or delegations from upstairs coming to find out what had become of their tea. Finally, Miss Hughes came back and summoned Thomas and Bates. After delivering them to Carson's pantry, Miss Hughes left and shut the door behind her.
Thomas,
said Carson.
can you verify that this is a letter that you received?
Oh, merciful bleeding heck! Thomas took it, his hand shaking slightly from Carson's hand, and was almost relieved to read, "Sorry it's taken me a long time to answer your last, but it's quite a story, and I wanted to be sure I had all of it before I wrote. To answer your question, yes, he is married. It wasn't good, certainly, but if O'Brien had had time for a thorough rummage through his letters, she could have found a lot worse." "What were you doing going through my things?" he demanded. "Going through your things?" O'Brien asked, her tone all injured innocence. "I wouldn't dream of it. I found it in the passage down here. You must have dropped it." He hadn't dropped it. It hadn't even been outside the attic since he'd shown it to Anna weeks ago. But if he said that, he'd have to admit he'd known its contents for weeks. O'Brien continued. "I only glanced at it to see who I should return it to, but the word jailbird caught my eye. And once I saw what it said, I knew Mr. Carson ought to know immediately."
"Yes, thank you, Mr. O'Brien,"
said Carson, not sounding particularly thankful.
"I take it you are familiar with this letter then, Thomas?"
There was no use trying to deny it now. It was up to Bates to try and defend himself. He handed the letter to Bates and said, "Yes." Carson looked as though he wanted to protest. He'd probably have liked to see what Bates came up with when he didn't know what he was accused of, but subsided long enough for Bates to read the letter. Once he'd folded it back up and handed it to Thomas, Carson said,
"Very well. You have seen what it says. Is it true?"
Bates hesitated for a long moment.
"Yes, sir. Essentially. I would like to say for the record that I never beat my wife, although Thomas's correspondent is correct that it was rumored I did, and that I have completely given up drinking." "But you were imprisoned for theft." "Yes, sir. A theft that your wife, in fact, committed."
Bates hesitated.
"I confessed under oath to the crime. And you did not feel it necessary to disclose any of this when you came to live and work here." "It isn't that I didn't consider it necessary. I just needed the work." Thomas really wished he wasn't standing here listening to this. There was a time not long past when he'd have given anything to see Bates taken down a peg, and in fact he still wouldn't have minded seeing it. But this wasn't taking him down a peg. This was ruining him. "I see,"
said Carson.
"and you do not consider that some other line of work might be more appropriate in your circumstances?"
Bates opened his mouth, closed it again, stiffened his spine, and said,
"No, sir."
Thomas would have trodden on his foot, except he didn't think Carson would at all amused.
"I will have to tell his lordship about this,"
Carson said.
"I understand, sir,"
said Bates. When they were dismissed from Carson's presence, Thomas immediately headed for the courtyard, gesturing for Bates to follow him. He was a little surprised when Bates actually did. "I didn't leave that letter lying around," he said, lighting a cigarette.
"I know,"
said Bates. "She nicked it out of my room." He was either going to have to start burning his letters after reading them or come up with a better way of hiding them.
"That's what I figured."
"You realize what's in that letter doesn't look a heck of a lot better for me than it does for you," Thomas pointed out. In fact, now that he'd had a bit of time to think about it, he saw that if O'Brien wanted to get them both in a single stroke, that particular letter was an expertly chosen weapon. While Joey'd been careful not to say anything that would prove anything in a court of law, it was fairly obvious what impression he'd gotten about why Thomas was asking about Bates. Carson might not have noticed it yet, but he would eventually. And if he didn't, O'Brien would find some way of bringing it to his attention. It would be just typical of his life if he got sacked for supposedly lusting after Bates of all people.
What do you mean?
Bates asked. Bollitt only had a quick look at it and had been focused on what it said about him. Thomas handed the letter to him. Read it again and imagine you're O'Brien and you hate my guts.
Bates read it again. I see,
he said, giving it back.
But his lordship will know there's nothing in it. Like your friend says, I don't see things that way. He knows that.
That doesn't matter. If Carson gets the idea I tried something like that in the house, he won't care whether I succeeded or not.
I can tell him you didn't actually try anything,
Bates pointed out. You think he's actually going to ask? That's precious. Thomas stamped out the dog end of his first cigarette and lit another one. It'll be, we both know why you can't stay. No need to spell it out. Bates thought for a moment.
All right, his lordship will want to talk to me. He won't just send Carson to sack me, I'm sure of it. So when he does, I'll try to explain. I won't mention Anna's name, and God help you if you do either. But I'll say I have reason to believe you were checking up on me on behalf of one of the women.
Thomas wasn't sure that would work. Even if his lordship and Carson believed that Joey had misunderstood why Thomas was asking about Bates, that would still leave the question of how Joey had come to make such a mistake. He could almost hear O'Brien saying, It's not exactly a natural mistake to make, is it? But he didn't have any better ideas, so he moved on. He doesn't know then about the... Thomas made a vague gesture that encompassed stealing, prison, the wife, and so on.
No, Anna told me I ought to own up, but... well, I didn't. I see she was right, but...
Thomas nodded. It was one thing to know that it was best to get your story in before you were caught, another to actually pick a moment and tell it. How interested is he going to be in what you have to say after he finds out about it?
I don't know,
said Bates.
He has some idea what viewers like. It's one of the things you do on campaign. Talk about the people you left behind. And he asked about her when I applied. Whether it would be a problem for me to be away from her. I think I got across that it was the reverse.
He shook his head.
I think you'll hear me out, maybe even sympathize, but I doubt I'll be working here much longer.
Bates attempted a smile.
So if you still want my job...
Even if he did, Thomas didn't think much of his chances of getting it. If what the letter implied didn't sink him, there was the matter of how long he'd kept it to himself. Or, if Bates did have his lordship's sympathy, Thomas's being involved in forcing him to sack his old war chum. Even if his involvement had been as an unwitting pawn. At this point, I'll count myself lucky to hang on to the one I've got. He tossed down his cigarette, wondering if he ought to light another one.
Look,
Bates said quickly. Tell Anna. Tell her yourself, Thomas advised. Bates' look of indignation made him realize how that sounded, so he explained, If you was sacked, you might as well go to London as anywhere else, and you know where to find her. If you don't want to turn up at Lady Rosamond's, find out what the visiting hours are at Mrs. Patmore's hospital, and catch her on her way in or out. Bates nodded.
You're right. I'm not even sure what I want to say to her, but I should say it in person, if I can manage it.
When they went back in, Carson appeared and took the letter back, saying that his lordship might want to see it. Thomas wished he'd taken advantage of the intervening time to burn the thing, however belatedly. For the rest of the afternoon, they endured O'Brien's swanking from the other end of the servants' hall table. Thomas was a little surprised she didn't do more than that. Taunt him somehow. But perhaps she was hoping he hadn't noticed yet that the trap that snared Bates would get him too. Taking the tea up to the library provided a welcome escape, though Thomas could not help eyeing his lordship as though he were a hungry tiger lurking in the corner of the room. But if he'd seen the letter yet, or spoken to Carson, he gave no sign of it. At last, Carson went up and rang the dressing gong. For Thomas, it meant a reprieve from O'Brien's presence, but Bates went off as though he were mounting the gallows. Idly, Thomas wondered if he'd willingly go to prison if it meant keeping Peter out of it. Maybe, he decided, but certainly not for, say, Philip, which seemed a better comparison from what he knew of Bates's relationship with Mrs. Bates. Bates had not yet come down by the time Thomas had to start taking the dinner up, and the first few courses kept him under Carson's eagle eye as he made the circuit of kitchen to servery and back again. The main course provided just enough of a lull that Thomas could poke his head into the servants' hall and see Bates sitting there looking gobsmacked. He gave Thomas what was probably supposed to be a meaningful nod, but what it meant Thomas couldn't guess. Enlightenment came nearly an hour later, after Carson came down from taking the ladies their coffee in the drawing-room.
Thomas, Mr. Bates, Miss O'Brien, his lordship wants to see you in the dining-room.
They all trooped up, a small parade with Carson in the lead. Thomas hung back with Bates, who was, of course, bringing up the rear.
It's all right,
Bates said in an undertone.
I can't quite understand it, but it's all right.
It was clear when they got into the dining room that O'Brien hadn't heard him. She was busy arranging her features into an expression of beatific innocence, which took some doing. His lordship, once they were all standing in front of him, said,
I've discussed with Bates what we learned from this letter, and he has explained the matter to my satisfaction.
Thomas wished desperately that he could turn to see the expression on O'Brien's face, but he couldn't exactly look away while his lordship was talking to him.
I do not wish for this to become a subject of gossip among the servants,
his lordship continued.
You are not to share this information with anyone else. Is that clear?
Yes, my lord, Thomas said promptly. Telling Anna couldn't count, he figured, since he'd done that before his lordship said not to. O'Brien, he saw out of the corner of his eye, nodded demurely.
Of course, my lord.
For a moment, Thomas thought that would be the end of it, but then she continued.
But now that I've had a chance to get over the shock of learning about Mr. Bates's past, I can't help but wonder why Thomas was making inquiries into whether or not Mr. Bates was married.
She turned to Carson.
Don't you think that's a bit peculiar?
She was doing this now? In front of his lordship? In the dining room? Granted, it was a strategy that would maximize Thomas's humiliation, but Carson wouldn't like it. As far as Carson was concerned, mentioning Thomas's sort upstairs might be almost as bad as being that sort to begin with.
I suppose, his lordship said slowly, that he wondered if Bates was married. Why else would he ask?
His tone was one of honest puzzlement, and Thomas wondered if Bates had forgotten that he'd promised to explain that part of things.
I'm sure I couldn't say, my lord,
O'Brien said, but pressed on.
But what about the part where he says it sounds a romantic story, but I should step carefully if I were you? What sort of advice is that for one man to give another?
All right, the first one, Thomas would admit, didn't sound like much without O'Brien's insinuating tone, but surely his lordship was about to catch on now. Carson jumped in.
Begging your pardon, my lord, but I believe this person was suggesting that it might be unwise for Thomas to become friendly with, if he, as he so colourfully put it, a jailbird. Knowing Mr. Bates as we do, we of course know better. But if I were familiar with only the facts that Thomas's correspondent included in the letter, I would likely give similar advice, in content if not in tone.
Carson could not possibly have missed what O'Brien thought was significant about that passage, but if he was playing dumb to his lordship, could Thomas hope that perhaps he'd continue the charade once they got downstairs? His hopes were dashed when O'Brien spoke up again.
And then there's the ending where he says that there's no sign Bates sees things our way. And then that comment about there being no women in South Africa.
What had she done? Chosen the most insinuating passages and learned them by heart? Thomas was only glad she'd never had the chance to read the one Philip wrote about his break.
I haven't the faintest idea,
said his lordship flatly.
Unless these phrases have some salacious meaning, which the rest of us are too innocent to comprehend. I cannot imagine why you believe I should be interested in them.
It wasn't until O'Brien's face froze into cold fury that Thomas realized what had just happened. His lordship knew what she was getting at. Of course he did. But now, trying to make it any plainer would only suggest that she had a dirty mind.
Well, she said, I'm sorry, my lord. I thought that perhaps they did mean something unseemly. I'm glad to hear I was mistaken. You were, said his lordship, and I should hope I do not have to mention that a ladyship should not be troubled with any of these matters, particularly in her condition.
If that's all, my lord, said Carson, we won't take up any more of your time.
Yes, said his lordship, I do believe that is quite all.
When Robert opened the door from his dressing room into his and Cora's bedroom, he was greeted by a low murmur of voices. He could only pick out a few words, "But why?" from Cora, and "I just like to say," from O'Brien. Then O'Brien noticed his arrival and said, "Will that be all, my lady?" "Yes, and good night," Cora told her. Once O'Brien had gone, Cora turned on the dressing table stool and said, "O'Brien was just dropping the strangest hints about something to do with Thomas and Bates, of all people."
"Let's see," Robert said grimly. "I suppose, I apologize, there was a concern, but I asked her not to bother you with it. I've already settled it."
"That explains why she was being so coy," Cora said, getting up and heading over to their bed. "But Bates isn't like that, is he?"
Robert froze in the act of removing his dressing gown.
"Like what?"
he asked a moment too late. Cora tilted her head and looked at him, her eyebrows raised.
"How do you know about that?"
he asked, finally finding his way out of the dressing gown.
"Robert, my dearest love, a woman with a house full of nearly grown daughters does not bring a footman that handsome under her roof without some assurance that it won't be a problem."
She shrugged and slid her legs under the covers.
"I wrote to the lady of the house where he worked before."
"Good God! Is he particularly handsome?"
Robert wondered. It seemed the safest part of that statement to wonder about. He'd always thought Thomas a bit strange-looking, pale as he was. Cora gave him the raised eyebrows again.
"Sybil made cow eyes at him for at least a month and a half when he first came. I don't think he even noticed."
Robert certainly didn't want to know anything more about that. Getting into bed, he changed the subject.
"No, Bates isn't like that at all. Did she say he was?"
That would be very strange, considering one of the passages she had insisted on quoting aloud had been about the fact that he wasn't.
"She didn't really say much at all," Cora explained. "I hoped Bates wasn't too upset by whatever it was Thomas did."
"Thomas didn't do anything," Robert said. "Apparently he'd been asking questions about Bates to a friend of his in the army on behalf of one of the maids. O'Brien got her hands on the letter somehow and tried to raise a stink."
"I'm sure she was just concerned,"
Cora said.
"I'm sure she dislikes both of them and enjoys making trouble," Robert countered, "which is the last thing you need in the circumstances."
"I'm pregnant, not ill," she reminded him. "But you did make it sound as though there were something about Bates that I ought to know."
Robert hesitated.
"He had a difficult time coming back from the war," he finally said. "The letter raised some questions. He was able to answer them to my satisfaction. If she raises the topic again, I would appreciate it if you would remind her of that."
"All right," Cora agreed. "If you're sure there's nothing to worry about."
"The only thing I'm worried about is O'Brien. She's on thin ice as far as I'm concerned. I specifically told her not to trouble you with this. She said she wouldn't, and did it anyway."
Cora frowned slightly.
"I don't give instructions to your valet," she pointed out.
That was true, and she hadn't interfered in Robert's choice to keep Bates on beyond making her opinion known.
"It's your decision," he conceded. "But doesn't it bother you the way she turned on Thomas? From being his staunchest champion to undermining him at every turn."
"I think she had her feelings hurt," Cora explained. "Back when poor Mr. Pamuk died here, she knew that Thomas knew something she didn't, and he must not have told her because she tried for weeks to get it out of me. I suppose she felt it was disloyal after she'd, as you said, championed him."
Robert had wondered if Thomas had managed to keep that secret from his best chum.
"If he refused to tell her at the cost of souring the friendship, I'm afraid that reflects much better on him than it does on her."
"It does," Cora said with a sigh.
"And what troubles me,"
he went on, getting back to the point,
"is what may happen the next time she has her feelings hurt."
As far as he knew, As far as Bates had been able to tell him, the only people in the house she had ever really liked were Thomas and Cora herself.
I'll speak to her,
Cora promised.
Thank you, Robert said. Blame it on me if you like. Tell her I'm fed up.